Good afternoon, Evergreen. I hope everybody's doing well. I'm going to read chapter 10 of Fang Spew in the Black Pond. The title of this one is Slayburn. Fang Spew sat in the open space between the northern edge of Black Pond and the tree line. The space was only about 7 yards wide, mostly short grass and mud, and flat. His attention was focused on an opening in the trees 10 yards away. He hoped that was enough distance. His thighs were quivering from the anticipation and adrenaline. His mouth was dry with a slight metallic taste, and Fang Spew, who never tasted metal, wondered why it did. The air was still, the sun setting, the other frogs carefully hidden away. The trap was set, and Fang Spew, the bait, thought about the events that led up to his being here. Man, it had been a rough September. He didn't say it aloud to the gathering, didn't need to, as those around him had lived through it. What he did say was, "I'm going to need some volunteers." And that set the frogs to buzzing among themselves. While they mulled it over, he remembered. The month had started with T-Moss and him successfully ridding T-Moss's tree of a tree puss. That had been exciting enough, but in truth, not too demanding. However, it had been during that adventure they had discovered the mutilated body of a frog. Horrible sight, and he was still thankful that Bubbles Lime had not seen it. It probably would have caused her nightmares for weeks. But that was just the beginning of the deaths. 2 more frogs disappeared before that week was out. In both cases, the frogs had been alone in the woods, goofing off, had never returned. One body was discovered by a subsequent search party, partially eaten. The other was never found. And then 4 frogs went missing the following week, and the frog elders put out the woods off limits. 3 of the bodies were found, mutilated and uneaten. That bit of news scared the community more than the deaths, as it indicated the killer was doing it for sport, not hunger. It is a rare animal indeed that kills for the fun of it. Fang Spew had heard there were such, but had never encountered one. T-Moss had never even heard of it, but started checking his gecko network. So far, nothing. During the 3rd week of the crisis, their questions were answered. The killer came out of the woods. It happened in the early evening when most frogs were splashing around in the pond, and a teenage frog was goofing off in the clearing between the pond and the tree line. An animal came out of the trees on the path and stood on its hind legs looking around. Its skin was pinkish with hair so thin it looked naked. It was about the size of a weasel, big eyes, small tail, big mouth. It made no sound, gave no warning, but slewed its eyes onto the lone teenager, and after the briefest of pauses, dropped to all fours and charged. Fang Spew was just getting out of the pond when the animal popped out of the woods. He recognized it for what it was, croaked out a "too late to do any good" warning as the animal charged, and stood in horrible awe at the speed the animal moved. One moment it was stood in the path entrance, the next it was grabbing the teenager by the throat and blurring off to the north in sudden squirming captive. The whole affair took less than 10 seconds, so fast the teenager didn't have time to croak with fright. The clearing became still and silent. The frogs were terrified. They never saw that teenager again. That incident triggered an immediate meeting of the frogs in Fang Spew's clan. The meeting was loud, discussions laced with hysteria. Most frogs were trying to describe what they and everyone else had seen. The oldest frog called for order, and Fang Spew echoed his call. Conversation gradually wore down, and Fang Spew asked to speak first. "Did anybody recognize that animal?" No one spoke up. So Fang Spew continued. "It was a slayburn, deadly, fast, with great eyesight." The crowd shifted uneasily, and someone toward the back spoke up. "Slayburn? What kind of name is that?" The old frog answered. "Slay means to kill. Burn comes from the color of its skin, pink. Like an animal that's been burned and the skin is healed. It doesn't mean they can spit fire, thankfully, but just describes that horrible color. Their strength is speed and great vision, and they kill for fun." A ripple of muttering spread through the crowd. Fang Spew signaled for silence and spoke again. "Brothers, we need to get the word out to the rest of the frogs about this attack. That slayburn is getting bolder, no longer attacking lone frogs in secret. The area between the forest and the shore is no longer safe, and we need to get that word out. I need 2 fast volunteers to circle the pond and get with the grim news. Anyone?" Hands went up. Fang Spew picked 2, one who was the winner from the summer solstice race, and they set off. He scanned the crowd, took a deep breath, and continued. "Okay, what are we going to do about this?" He immediately wished he had not asked that question, as the crowd again erupted in noise, everyone talking at once. It was with some difficulty and much shouting that he finally got order. He asked his question again, but tried to present it better. If anyone has a good idea on how to defeat the Slaburn, see me after this meeting. Otherwise, we will reconvene tomorrow morning. See you then. And without waiting to hear if any frogs had any good ideas, he quietly slipped away, heading up the path to see T-Moss. He made his way quickly up there to T-Moss's tree home. He arrived there in short order, croaked for T-Moss. T-Moss interrupted just as he was getting ready for bed, stuck his head out of the hole halfway up the trunk, and seeing who it was, shouted that he'd be right down. Fangspew brought T-Moss up to speed on the day's troubles and told him they needed a plan to rid the pond of his most serious threat. T-Moss stewed over the problem. You see the Slaburn was quick? Very. And he has good eyesight? That's what I'm told. Maybe this is a way to use his strength against him. Let me think. Fangspew kept quiet. He knew his friend well, and if anyone could come up with a viable plan, he trusted T-Moss to do so. The darkness deepened, and the moon made its lazy appearance over the trees. Still, Fangspew kept quiet. T-Moss hummed to himself, thinking. After a few more minutes, he broke his silence and asked a couple of questions. The Slaburn came out of the path? Yes. Was there any noise? Any warning that he'd show up? Fangspew shook his head back and forth. Since frogs can't shake their heads like humans do, no neck, right? They shake with their eyes. T-Moss lapsed back into thoughtful silence. After several more minutes passed, T-Moss ventured an idea. Two friends discussed it, worked out a few kinks, and then agreed to meet first thing in the morning to present the plan to the frogs. Fangspew set off back to the pond in bed, hopping quietly. He was listening very intently in case the Slaburn was still hunting. The next morning dawned early for Fangspew, who had spent a restless night going over the plan from all angles. He wasn't really particularly happy with the plan, but could come up with no alternatives. So when the frogs gathered in the clearing, he and T-Moss presented it to them. The plan was agreed upon with no changes, and Fangspew asked for and got 2 groups of volunteers. He set the first group of 4 big frogs to work gathering long reeds from the pond's edge, weaving the reeds together to make a rope about 2 feet in length. T-Moss oversaw this effort and was a big help as he put his remarkably dexterous hands to work. The second group, made up of 20 frogs, was led by Fangspew. He instructed the group to gather stones. He was specific in size, as big as possible, but small enough to throw. He remembered that at the bottom of the pond were stones about the right size, and he showed the group where to find them. Each frog gathered 5 or so stones and stockpiled them in the clearing. After a late lunch, early dinner, he directed the first group to hide themselves near the opening in the path. They did so, 2 frogs on either end of the rope stretched across the opening. The second group took up position about 2 feet from the first, hidden in deep grass in the area. Fangspew took his position out in the open of the clearing alone. The sun completed its arc toward the western horizon. The trap was set, and Fangspew, the bait, thought about the events that led up to being here. Man, it has been a rough September, he said, and waited. Time passed. He remained focused on the path opening. The temperature dropped, and he thought that summer had almost bled out. Fall was close. He heard a noise behind him, but didn't move. T-Moss came up behind him, and saying nothing, sat. He smiled wanly at his friend, thankful, relaxed a bit in the knowledge that he wasn't alone. He had his best friend to decide. It was just minutes sitting together when the Slaburn showed up. He came out of the path, stood there, eyes darting around, seeing nothing of the first or second group. Its attention settled on Fangspew and T-Moss, and did it smile? Fangspew's breath froze in his chest, and all of a sudden the Slaburn was a blur of speed, heading directly toward the frog and the gecko. Timing was critical here. As the Slaburn raced toward Fangspew and T-Moss, and the frogs in the first group performed brilliantly. They stood and raised the rope up just in time to trip the Slaburn as it hit full speed. Its feet tangled in the rope, it fell headlong into the clearing. The frogs at each end of the rope were dragged afoot until the Slaburn skidded to a stop. Then they hopped toward the opposite group, keeping the rope around the feet of the Slaburn. T-Moss's idea, you should know. The looping of the rope effectively rendered the animal stationary, and the second group rose up with their stones. The frogs started throwing stones at the animal, but here was an unforeseen problem. The stones, pebbles really, simply bounced off the tough pink skin, doing no damage. Fang's view and T-Moss's mistake was understandable. Small rocks would have seriously hurt frogs and geckos with their thin skin, but it did nothing to the sleigh burn. It twisted and jerked to escape, and Fang's view knew he only had brief minutes until the animal broke free and raged among the frogs now all out in the open. He threw a rock, saw the big eyes staring directly at him, thought of the teenager carried off yesterday, rigid with panic. He thought of the dismembered frogs. And lastly, he heard T-Moss's words, "Turn its strengths against it," and he changed the plan, making a quick modification. "Throw at its eyes," he shouted. "Its eyes!" He croaked the message over the shouts and croaks of the throwers, joined by the small voice of T-Moss, and cocked his arm back. He let the rock fly at the animal's eyes, missed, hit its mouth, picked up another rock. Other frogs adjusted their aim, and the rock started to impact those large eyes. The Fangspew blinked furiously, but some of the smaller rocks got caught between the eyeball and the eyelid, scraping the eye badly. The animal heaved desperately as T-Moss threw a fastball, accurately nailing it in one's left eye. The Slaburn blinked more, and this time that eye stayed closed. A red tear escaped from the closed lid, and the right eye registered fear. The Slaburn gave a tremendous heave, and the rope broke. Frogs scattered, mostly heading for the safety of the pond. The animal staggered to its feet, but its interests were no longer on the frogs. Blood ran from both eyes, the left closed, the right barely open. It probably never saw Fangspew sitting there just feet from it. Rather, it took a clumsy step back toward the path, fell down, struggled back to its feet, stumbled toward the path. It ran into low branches, fell again, blindly headed up the path. Frogs never saw the sleigh burn again. Fangspew turned to T-Moss, and still there beside him, and still holding the rock, and hugged him fiercely. He said, "What a friend! Who could ask for better?" Then he and the gecko were surrounded by backslapping and joyous croaking. Maybe the summer would last a little longer. The end.